My name is Rissy, and today we are going to talk about the surprising origins of Arthurian kingship. Now, I want to establish, before we get very far in the seminar, this is not going to be a talk about whether or not King Arthur was a real person. We are not here to discuss his historicity. We are not here to talk about Lucius Artorius Castus or Sarmatians or anything like that. That's all cool stuff, but that's a whole different panel. Today, we are here to talk about King Arthur in the context of someone who was written about in history, someone who was written about in literature, and how they got to be written about that way. Specifically, we're going to be discussing the work of Geoffrey of Monmouth, who was a maybe Welsh, maybe Breton man of the cloth, who around 1136 AD wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, or there's actually kind of a scholar fight right now going on. It might be titled Concerning the Deeds of the Britons. And so we're going to be talking about Arthur specifically in that context and some other contexts that, well, you'll be learning about shortly. So we're going to have to keep this to about 40 minutes, and then I'll leave some time for Q&A at the end so that we can be out of here on time, make sure that we've got plenty of time for the people coming afterwards. So save up those questions. But to begin, I would like to pose all of you a question, and don't hesitate to throw up your hands and burst out if you got the answer. So if I were to tell you a story of a great and powerful king who had triumphed over enemies against impossible odds, risen to greatness, but then one day he chanced to look upon a beautiful woman, more beautiful than any woman he had ever seen, and he was inflamed with passion for her. But she was already married. She was married to a man in his military service, his loyal ally, friend, counselor, and servant. So he had her husband killed in battle, so that he could sleep with her, adulterously. Then they would go on to marry, and they would have a son who would become an even greater king than he had been. Whose story am I telling you? David. Got it in one. You guys are great. So yes, this is definitely, as I will demonstrate for you, the story of David, Bathsheba, and Solomon from the Old Testament in the book of Samuel, but it is also, thanks to Geoffrey of Monmouth, the story of Uther Pendragon, Igraine, and King Arthur. And so we're going to discuss like these biblical parallels, but not just the parallels of them in and of themselves. We're going to get into why this is, because this is a lurid tale, a story of a man so obsessed with a woman that he gets a wizard to enchant himself into that woman's husband's likeness so he can sneak in and have sex with her. This is basically rape by fraud. And since in theory he was conceived this way, doesn't that make Arthur a bastard? Isn't bastardy kind of a problem when it comes to royal succession and inheritance, right? So what we're going to look at is why Geoffrey of Monmouth would choose to append this lurid tale of adulterous passion, murder, and bastardy onto the man who is his greatest and most noble hero in this book, onto King Arthur. Now, when he wrote this, Monmouth, and I'm just, for future reference, Geoffrey of Monmouth is a lot to say, and I'm always tempted, since it's spelled G-E-O, to call him Geoffrey of Monmouth. So I'm just going to refer to him as Monmouth, and when I say his name, I'm also just going to be referring to this book. He wrote other things, but we're really only going to be talking about this. So when I say Monmouth, that's what I mean. So he claimed that he had a secret source, a very old book written in the Welsh language that had been given to him by Walter, the Archdeacon of Oxford, and that nobody else was allowed to have it, and that's why he had the lowdown on Arthur's story. So we're gonna take a look at his secret or not so secret source and see why exactly he chose this path, even though it could mean ruin for his greatest heroes. first, let's look at those parallels some more, right? I can hear you saying, what about the shape-shifting? In the story of David and Bathsheba, there isn't any shape-shifting, although technically that is not true. In some of the Jewish commentary on this incident, there is a little bit of shape-shifting. When David is out walking on the walls of the king's house, Bathsheba is on the roof of another building. She's bathing behind a screen, and Satan turns himself into a bird and flies in front of the screen, and David is like, I gotta get that bird. And so he shoots at the bird, which flies away, and the screen is shattered, revealing Bathsheba in all her naked beauty. But we can be pretty sure that a Christian cleric would not have been capable of reading the Hebrew, he would have been using the Latin Bible at the time. We don't have any evidence that he would have been able to read that. So we can probably cross that off the list in terms of where the shape-shifting element of the story comes from, right? So how can we actually be sure that the main source of Arthur's conception myth begins in the biblical Old Testament? Because after all, this conception story has some pretty impressive similarities to the stories of Heracles, stories told about Alexander the Great, an Irish hero called Mungane, and of course, the great Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut. All of these figures had a similar story where someone takes the form of a woman's husband to sleep with her and fathers a great hero. So maybe Monmouth was borrowing from one of those sources, and what he wanted was to say, yes, my guy, Arthur, well, he's got the same birth story as Heracles. He is just that much of a great hero. And I would agree that the shape-shifting part of the story certainly does come from one of those, because our man Monmouth loved to borrow. He was a voracious reader. He read a lot, and when he wrote, he was not shy about lifting inspiration from any number of sources. Oftentimes in the same passage, you'll have classical sources, biblical sources, Old Welsh sources, all crammed together. He was extremely syncretic in his approach, and again, not shy about it. The shape-shifting in this instance probably comes from what is called the Alexander Romance, which was a story that had been written first in Greek and then had a Latin translation, so he would definitely have been able to read it and access it. It was popular with medieval audiences. And in that, an Egyptian pharaoh, Nectanebo II, is exiled from his land and washes up at the court of Philip of Macedon. He conceives a passion for Philip's beautiful wife, Olympias, the one who let snakes sleep in her bed. Yeah, she was an interesting character. And he changes himself into her husband so that they can sleep together, and thus Alexander is conceived. So yeah, I would say we know that he had access to that source, and that's probably where the shape-shifting aspect comes from. But, big fat but, there are some crucial differences between Arthur's conception story and all of the ones I just mentioned. For one thing, Uther is a man. He is not a god. He is not a wizard. He has to get help from the wizard Merlin in order to make this transformation. And so, okay, that's a minor detail, maybe just a quibble. Well, in all of those other stories, the cuckolded husband does not die. In Arthur's story and David's story, he dies pretty much immediately and is killed in battle. Then there is what is referred to by Arthurian scholars as the narrative anomaly in Monmouth's work. What this is so we are told that when Uther slept with Igraine on that one magical night, that they conceived Arthur, whose prowess afterwards secured his fame. And then, a little bit later, in a similar passage, we are told that once Igraine's husband is out of the way, Uther marries her and takes over the castle, and then they had 2 children named Arthur and Anna. So we're basically told that Arthur is conceived twice. This is a little weird, right? That you would say, yeah, they conceived him this night, oh, and then they got married, and then they conceived him. That's a bit strange. This echoes the fact that, well, Solomon was not the child originally conceived by David and Bathsheba. That baby dies because that baby was the product of adultery, and God said, eh. And so that baby dies. It's effectively like, so conception Arthur, and then they got married and had 2 kids. Well, we skipped a baby. effectively. So the narrative anomaly could easily be carried over from the biblical source. This is also, the anomaly persists in the people who adapted Monmouth's work into Norman French, into Welsh. There's always this weird kind of passage where we conceived Arthur, ... Oh yeah, then we got married and we had 2 kids named Arthur, and well, most people ditch his sister Anna after a certain point.
That's 10.
10, oh, thank you. So Monmouth also lifts some language directly from the Latin Bible in this part of the story, and the language that he lifts comes from the first book of Kings, which is where we learn all about Solomon. There's also the fact that in the story of David and Bathsheba, David sleeps with her and he's like, oh crap, okay, she might be pregnant, what am I gonna do? So he's like, hey, Bathsheba's husband, Uriah the Hittite, why don't you come and take a vacation from battle? You have been working so hard. You need a break, man. Why don't you go home, eat some food, drink some wine, sleep with your wife, so we can cover up this pregnancy? And he's like, no, screw you. My men are out in the field sleeping in tents. I'm not going to abandon them. I am not going home. I will eat no food, drink no wine, and sleep with no wives. Bye! So then David has to have him killed to cover up the pregnancy. Well, in Monmouth's story, when he realizes that Uther, the king, has fomented this horrible passion for his wife, Gorla, the Duke of Cornwall, Igraine's husband, gets up, packs up his shit, and leaves angrily. There is a moment where Uther tries to summon him to return and is refused. So we've got just parallels all over the place. And if I have not yet managed to convince you that the David and Bathsheba story is the source for Arthur's conception, well, there is literally a version of Monmouth that straight up says so. This is called the first variant version. There is some scholarly debate as to when this was written. Some people literally think this was Monmouth's source and he just ripped off the whole thing. There are some people who think this was an early adaptation. One of the most striking differences between the two texts is that while they're telling all the exact same stories, the person who wrote the first variant version will just tell you where the references come from. So in this version of the document, it specifically says in the Latin that the love of Uther for Igraine was like the love of David and Bathsheba. So we can be pretty much 100% sure that that is the source of the story. So okay, that means King Uther is King David. But doesn't all of the scholarship discussing biblical parallels in Arthurian literature, especially Monmouth, say that Arthur is actually King David? And yes, Arthur is David. To medieval audiences, King David was the ultimate paragon of righteous masculinity. There's a book about David and masculinity that is called Thou Art the Man. Which is something that God literally says to him, thou art the man. So David is the man, right? He is militaristic. He has sex with lots of women. He has lots of strong, healthy sons. He's just everything that a masculine man could and should be, especially in the minds of medieval scholars. And so Arthur, in similar fashion, wins great victories over evil pagans. In this case, it's not the Philistines, it's the Saxons that are invading. Arthur also, in Monmouth, literally slays a giant. He actually slays 2 giants. After he slays the first one, he's like, you know what I should do is have a flashback about the last time I slayed a giant. Man, that was fucking cool, wasn't it? I killed the shit out of that guy. So yeah, Arthur, giant slayer, righteous warrior. And yeah, y'all, this book is buck wild, and I don't even have time today to touch on the incestuous homoerotic cannibalism that happens towards the end. Okay, so Arthur is David because Geoffrey of Monmouth is a biblical mixologist. But Arthur is also explicitly King Solomon. His reign, unlike basically the reigns of all the people that came before him, his father Uther especially, and Uther's brother Ambrosius Aurelianus, who had previously been king, Arthur's reign is full of peace and prosperity. There are wars, but there are not unceasing wars the way there are for previous kings. Also, his court is described uniquely in this text as the envy of the world. It is a marvel of glittering sophistication. People all over the world count themselves as worthless if they were not dressed in the style of Arthur's knights and the ladies of his court. You get people from around the world showing up and having their minds just completely blown at how magnificent Arthur's court is, which of course echoes the Queen of Sheba episode in the Book of Kings. Then Arthur, uniquely again in the text, is directly praised for his wise mind. Yes, he is deliberately called wise. What happens is he gives a speech and another character turns directly to the camera and was like, "Oh my God, Arthur, you're just so smart. Your words are drenched in Cicero's honey, and your wise mind has provided a solution to this horrible problem that we are facing." Right? So Monmouth is going out of his way to put in dialogue that makes us know Arthur is famous for his wisdom. And maybe a little bit unlike Solomon, Arthur actually makes a lot of good choices. Like, Solomon is described as wise, and he did pray to the Lord for wisdom, but he doesn't necessarily use it all of the time. Arthur does. In this book, he is a very canny general. He uses tricks and stratagems. He always has a backup plan for his armies. Like, every time they go into battle, he makes sure that there's a backup legion stationed somewhere that the enemy doesn't know about, so they can sweep in at the last minute if the tide of battle turns. So it's not just that we're told that Arthur is wise. Arthur actually behaves in a wise manner. Well, okay, so Arthur is King David, and he is Alexander the Great, and he is Solomon. But that still doesn't explain why Monmouth chose to graft this story onto Arthur, right? With, all the bastardy, murder, adultery, and whatnot. So, maybe we should look even more closely at David and Solomon's stories for clues. And I use the word clue deliberately, because y'all, this is a murder mystery. You see, what's really interesting about the two greatest kings of the biblical Old Testament is that neither of them was supposed to be king at all, right? So let's start with David. David is a nobody from nowhere whose dad is a shepherd. He is not a very important person in the beginning of his life. Well, how does he end up as king? Because the Israelites decided that everybody's doing it, so we want a king too. The Babylonians have kings, the Amalekites have kings, and Gibeonites have kings. Well, we want our very own king. And the prophets and the elders are like, you guys don't want kings. Kings are bad. Kings will tax the shit out of you to fund their wars, and they'll conscript your sons and get them killed. And the Israelites like, no, give us a king, right? So the prophets choose Saul. Saul is the anointed king. He's the one who's supposed to be sitting on the throne. And he has a buttload of sons and grandsons. David enters the story when Saul starts to suffer from mental illness, and David plays the lyre for him, and it soothes his troubled mind. Then, in the famous battle with Goliath, David volunteers to fight a dude who's 9 feet tall and successfully wins with a slingshot. And so he becomes incredibly popular, and people are like, man, that David guy is pretty great. I don't know about Saul. Saul's kind of weird. Maybe he shouldn't be our king anymore, even though he is the chosen and anointed one. Then Saul and most of his sons die off screen. Yeah, we don't get a great final battle for them, and Saul himself either killed himself by falling on his sword when he saw that a battle was lost, or was just killed by some random guy, as well as his sons. So not a very dramatic or heroic death. But he's still got some sons left, right? And he has got a bunch of grandsons, so his dynasty could continue, and that's what you would assume would happen in this situation. Well, one of his sons takes the throne and manages to rule for 2 whole years before he gets fragged. He is killed by his own military commanders. Oh, well, that's interesting. And then finally, God tells David, hey buddy, it's time for you to be king now. I don't like Saul or his dynasty anymore. They're gross and icky. They have cooties. You're the king. You're the one who should be anointed. Oh, and also, you should let the Gibeonites execute all of Saul's remaining sons and grandsons, so that his dynasty utterly perishes from the earth. How convenient! Yeah, you guys, God told me I have to do this. I have to make sure that it is totes okay to slaughter any remnants of my rival's dynasty, that they will no longer be a threat to my ascension to the throne. What does this sound like? This sounds like political and religious propaganda used by a murderous usurper to the throne who is trying to cover his tracks. He's like, well, you know, what if I got someone to write the chronicles of my story? We write about how Saul sucked and I'm supposed to be king and it was okay that I had all of them murdered, right?
That's funny.
Thank you. Now, we do know that David, or people claiming to be descended from David, have a basis in the archaeological record. There's something called the Tel Dan Stela. It's like a stone thing, and it's got some carvings on it in Aramaic. There's an inscription that claims, where someone is claiming a military victory over the house of David. So there is some historical attestation here. And so this part of the Bible could very easily be propaganda that David, or someone very much like him, used to cover up violent usurpation of the legitimate monarch. This could be historical revisionism written by the winners, as history usually is. Then let's go to Solomon. Solomon, not supposed to be king either, because David had a lot of wives and had a lot of sons. There were quite a few guys ahead of Solomon in the succession. There's a very, very weird passage in the first book of Kings where David has gotten all old and infirm, and suddenly Bathsheba shows up and she's like, hey, husband, do you remember that promise you totally and legitimately made to me where you agreed that our son Solomon would be king and not any of the other sons that you have? And then the prophet Samuel comes in and is like, hey, David, do you remember that promise you made to your wife Bathsheba, who's right here, about how her son Solomon would be king and not any of your other sons? This is strange, right? Because this is never mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. You'd think this moment where David made this promise, that somebody would have written about it instead of having to remind us towards the end of the story. And so David agrees, and so David's other sons get totally skipped, and Solomon goes to the front of the line and becomes king. He has an incredibly easy route to the throne. And this promise probably never happened. There's also the fact that Solomon, historically speaking, if he were real, or maybe the version in the Bible, is almost certainly not David's biological son, because Bathsheba was previously married, and David marries her immediately after her husband dies. Of course, in the medieval period, or not medieval period, in antiquity, people didn't really understand as much about pregnancy as we do now. They wouldn't know how to precisely date things. So if a woman had been previously married, oftentimes you'd want to make sure that you waited to make sure she didn't get pregnant before marrying her, because you don't want somebody else becoming your heir if they're not your child. So the fact that Solomon is going to inherit, well, let's say you were like David and you were a usurper. Let's say you wanted to take the throne, but you were actually the son of somebody else, and then David is your stepdad. Well, what would you do? You'd want to concoct a story that gives you a link to the king, some crucial biological continuity, a story proving beyond all doubt that David was Solomon's father. So if you were trying to do this to prove your paternity to someone who'd been married to another man quite recently, how would you do that? Well, you would make up a story that said the king and your mom had totally been doing it before your dad, or well, your not dad, died, and that your not dad had refused to sleep with his wife. Since we are explicitly told this, Uriah and Bathsheba did not have sex during this time period. So the only possible father for Solomon could therefore be David. That is exactly the type of story that a usurper with no business on the throne would make up. And of course, this convenient detail of their immediate marriage means that despite the adultery, Solomon is not illegitimate. So the story of David and Bathsheba and their adulterous passion is what is called a legitimization myth. It is a legitimization myth for Solomon. Now, what is a legitimization myth? Well, this stuff goes back a long, long ways. We have 4,000 years of this kind of literature, which is lists of kings and things like that, and it's very common for, if somebody is usurping the throne, they make up a story about how actually they're the long-lost grandson of one of the previous 5 generations of kings. Because the whole point is, you want to grease that path to the throne, even if you had to kill a bunch of people. You still want others to accept your rule. You want this to be as easy as possible, so you just have somebody make up some stories. One of my favorite examples of all time is that of Sargon of Akkad, who was not a king, not in the royal line. He was the son of a gardener, staged a violent coup, and then afterwards, well, Sargon was not his name. Sargon is a name he adopted, and do you know what it means? It literally means legitimate king. I love imagining him as King Arthur in the Monty Python movie, "We are all Acadians, and I'm your legitimate king." It says so in my name. And then, for examples, I mentioned Hatshepsut earlier. Well, so Hatshepsut was a remarkable woman, one of the very few women to rule over Egypt as pharaoh. And she started off as the regent for her son, and then at some point she just decided, you know what, I'm gonna do this actually. I'm going to wield power now, openly. And then a story starts to circulate about how she is actually the child of a god. How the god took the form of her mother's husband to sleep with her mother and engendered Hatshepsut. And we can be pretty sure this did not arise organically. This is propaganda. This is propaganda for a usurper. That's what legitimization myths are. They're here to establish that continuity, to say, no, I have the right to be on the throne. This belongs to me. You don't have to doubt my rightness as king. And this is why our man Monmouth needed to borrow the story of David and Bathsheba to establish Arthur's paternity as the son of a king beyond any doubt, because paternity, or brotherhood, in Monmouth is the source of rightful kingship. And he needed a legitimization myth for Arthur because Arthur wasn't supposed to be a king either. So Monmouth is generally referred to as the Great Divide in Arthurian literature. The Latin form of Geoffrey's is Galfridus, so you hear of literature as pre-Galfridian or post-Galfridian. That's how important and influential this text is. Monmouth invented Excalibur, he invented the Isle of Avalon, he invented Guinevere committing adultery while she was married to Arthur. He basically invented, 75% of what you would think of as Arthur's story, and there was basically none of that came before. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the oldest sources for Arthur and how Arthur did not begin as a king, even though that is what he is incredibly famous for. You don't just say Arthur, you say King Arthur, right? So Arthur's legend is old, but it isn't as old as the 5th century, at least probably not. We have some Welsh sources, and I will say there is a lot of scholarly debate on how to establish the date at which some of these sources were written, because the manuscripts are mostly things from like the 1300s, 1400s, 1500s, right? So they don't come from when Arthur would have been real or when the people were writing about him and his legend. They come from much later, and they're probably collections of older works. Now, what you can do is analyze the language. And how it's used, the forms of different names, to try and get an idea of when this was actually written for the first time, and thus we can date the beginning of Arthur's legend. So what do we have? A lot of old Welsh poetry, and it's as difficult to interpret as it is to pronounce. There's a poem called, and apologies to any Welsh speakers, Y Gododdin, which is a series of elegies for young men killed in a catastrophic battle. And in this, there's an incredible line about one of the warriors who's described as a mighty palisade in battle. He glutted black ravens on the ramparts, but he was no Arthur. Right? So it's like, wow, what an incredible warrior this guy must have been, right? But that's it. That's literally all we have for the reference to Arthur.
That's 30.
Thank you. We are not told any other details. He's not a king, or at least doesn't have a kingdom. We don't even really know where he's from, or what army he was fighting for, or who he killed. And this is kind of how it goes in the early Welsh poems. We see Arthur as a ferocious warrior. He also, as we move forward through time, sometimes he picks up a band of heroes. And they do things like fight boars, they slay monsters, they rescue people trapped in enchanted castles. And sometimes we even start to hear names like Kay and Bedivere and Gawain. So yeah, those names get associated with Arthur very early on, and the thought is that they were characters from other stories who, as Arthur got more popular, were sort of pulled into his orbit. But he is not a king. He is a hero, he is a leader of men, but he's not a king yet. And then, in the 9th century, along comes a guy named Nennius, or, well, that is what I am going to call him. This person wrote, or a person calling themselves Nennius, wrote a text that is the foundational one for Arthur, the Historia Britonum, and we don't think that his name was Nennius, so people call him pseudo-Nennius. It's very confusing. I'm just going to call him Nennius. So he creates Arthur as we know him. Or the beginnings of Arthur as we know him. So what is he writing? So what is the Historia Britonum? Imagine you are a Welsh priest, and finally, after hundreds of years of strife, your church, the church in Wales, and the church in Rome have finally reconciled to each other after brutally feuding over the date of Easter. Like, people went absolutely insane over this shit. And so a lot of Christian scholars had written huge historical tracts just shitting all over Welsh people. Right? Welsh people are the absolute worst. God sent the Saxons to kick their asses and punishing them for not respecting our date of Easter. Those goddamn assholes. Fuck those assholes, right? And just on and on and on, in some of the most flowery Latin you would have ever heard. And so you're a Welsh guy, the churches have finally been, reconciled, and you're like, actually, I think I'd like to do a little bit of image mending for the Welsh people. So when Nennius is telling the story of these Saxon invasions, he invents a character named Arthur. And this is the mention of Arthur the Dux Bellorum, the leader of battle. So maybe you've heard of this reference. So it is said that Arthur fought with the kings of the Britons, but he himself was the Dux Bellorum, the leader of battles. Now, there has been a lot of scholarly debate on this, about whether this Arthur could be king, right? Because he's commanding kings, wouldn't it make sense that he was a king? Well, the problem is he absolutely could not have been in this text, because Arthur in Nennius is based on the biblical figure of Joshua. Yes, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. I can finally put my Christian fundamentalist upbringing to good use. So Joshua is a mighty leader of men into battle, but he is explicitly not a king, because the Israelites didn't have kings until Saul. So based on the figure that Nennius is drawing on, because the term Dux Bellorum in the Latin Bible is the term used for Joshua, right? So we can connect those two dots, and so Arthur is still not a king at this point, although this is the most solidly he's ever been instantiated. We know that he's in Wales, we know roughly the date, we know that he's fighting Saxons, we even know a few of the names of the battles that are given. But after Nennius, Arthur starts to transition into a king. In some Welsh poetry, he is a king with a court that includes William the Conqueror, which would be very weird, amongst other heroes. Sometimes he's a king, sometimes he still isn't, sometimes he's just a wandering adventurer. we also start to see him popping up in hagiographies or descriptions of the lives of various saints. And oh my God, y'all, these are hilarious because Arthur always behaves like a spoiled brat who's just there to basically be humiliated by whoever the saint is. Because of course, Arthur is not the main character in these stories, it's the saint. But so sometimes he's a king, sometimes he's a hero, sometimes he's a tyrant, and sometimes he's the co-king, ruling with somebody else, an older man who sits back and passes the judgment and makes the laws while Arthur goes out and has adventures. And also, in histories that were being written in Monmouth's time, Arthur is specifically not a king yet. I think it's William of Malmesbury who wrote something saying that Ambrosius Aurelianus was the king, Arthur was basically just his employee. So, finally, when Monmouth starts to write his work, he's decided, he says so basically directly in the text, I am the authority for this. I've got the secret source. I am going to tell you exactly all the details about Arthur once and for all, setting the record straight. Monmouth makes Arthur the king, and to crown him, he plucks the crown of David and Solomon to legitimize the new version of the character once and for all as the king. And to do it, he had to invent a father for Arthur to make him king. Because Uther, there's a guy named that floating around in Welsh poetry, but he's maybe kind of attached to Arthur's court as one of his servants. This is the first time Uther is linked to Arthur in a familial relationship. And then we had the conception myth establishing him firmly as Uther's son, and thus he is the king. Arthur has to be, for Monmouth, the most legit of legitimate kings, because he is central to Monmouth's message. The message of this book can basically be boiled down to Britain good, Civil War bad. Civil war is the big bad in this book. It is the ultimate enemy against which all kingdoms fall. Arthur, in this, is of course famously not brought down by any of the campaigns he wages against the Saxons or against the Romans at one point. He is brought down by treachery. His nephew, Mordred as we know him now, usurps the throne and steals Guinevere from him, or Gunhumara as she's called in this work. So his reign does not fall from without, but from within. And in this, Mordred is not Arthur's son, he is Arthur's treacherous nephew, or well rather, and most importantly, do keep this in mind, he is the nephew of Arthur's father. Monmouth calls him his nephew, but when you actually read the genealogy, you find out Uther and Ambrosius Aurelianus had a sister who married a guy who produced Mordred, right? Mordred is the old king's nephew, and this is very, very important. A few kings, so this book is basically a huge king list. Shortly after Arthur's tragic fall, Monmouth goes on a gigantic rant about how the Britons are the stupidest, biggest assholes ever because they had this incredible kingdom and they threw it all away because of civil war and because they wouldn't line up behind one rightful monarch. That's interesting. Like, he basically goes like Charlton Heston, you maniacs! You blew it up! Damn you all to hell! Like, this is a huge rant that he goes on. So speaking of treacherous nephews, does anyone here know what was going on in England in 1136 while Monmouth was writing? Well, if you're a fan of the Sex Pistols, you definitely know, because it's anarchy in the UK. So this period is called the Anarchy, where the old king, Henry I, William the Conqueror's son, had died, and he had no legitimate male children. He did have a daughter named the Empress Matilda, as you may have heard her called, because she had been previously married to one of the Holy Roman Emperors, and she kept the title her whole life. And so, in an effort to stabilize the transition of power, he made all the barons in England swear an oath to her, to Empress Matilda, to be loyal to her. The problem is that the second Henry died, his nephew, Stephen, seized the throne, usurped the throne from Matilda, kicking off a giant civil war called the Anarchy that went on for about 20 years. It was bloody and horrible. Although there are a couple of funny episodes. Both Matilda and Stephen were at one point captured by the other side, and Matilda literally did make a rope out of bed sheets to sneak out of the tower. Yeah, I imagine she giggled herself to sleep for a week after that. But so this background of the Civil War brings all these things into focus. Why does Geoffrey of Monmouth need to legitimize a king to have had the most beautiful kingdom ever, the kingdom of Britain, the kingdom the Normans have inherited, and now he is desperate to stop this civil strife that is going on, and saying that it's wrong for anybody who doesn't back up behind the legitimate ruler who is the legitimate child of the previous ruler. This is how he establishes kingship and what is rightful kingship. And interestingly, he dedicated this book to Robert of Gloucester, who was Henry I's illegitimate son and one of Matilda's biggest supporters. So Monmouth wants people to get in line behind the rightful ruler, and the rightful ruler is the child of the previous king.
That's 40.
Thank you. So just a couple more notes. Basically, this book was an international smash hit bestseller. It went on to be incredibly famous and influential, in not just in Arthurian tradition, but also, so we've already seen the work of legitimization myths and Arthur used as a political football. Well, the monarchs of England would go on to do this for several hundred years afterwards. My favorite example is that of Edward I. If you've seen Braveheart, he's the evil old king, Edward the Longshanks. And this literally happened. He sent a letter to the Pope saying that it was totes okay for him to brutally put down this rebellion in Scotland on the grounds that King Arthur did it first. And I just love to imagine the Pope sitting at his Pope desk with his Pope hat going, Mamma mia, why do I have to put up with this bullshit? That's not the only example. There's lots more. Edward III wanted to found a whole series of knights based on King Arthur and his knights. Henry VIII had himself painted onto a round table. But so we see Arthur continue as he began, as a political football, as a legitimization myth. And that, my friends, is the surprising origin of Arthurian kingship. Woo! And so we do have plenty of time for questions if anybody has them. Yes?
Were there contemporary responses from the other political side saying, don't believe this,
Yes, actually there totally was. Some Scottish lords wrote back and were like, well, Arthur died without having any children, so your claim on the throne through him is totally bullshit. Some Scottish clans would eventually go on to try and claim descent from Arthur. People are always making up various kids he might or might not have had. So yeah, this does go on, like, every side in the political battle is always trying to claim Arthur for themselves. It's extremely interesting and a lot of fun. Yes?
Yeah, so it's always been very fascinating to me, the international bestseller bit.
Yeah.
It's not like Arthur's the only story in town. I know, the Charlemagne has like a number of
yeah, he does.
But I was wondering whether or not the biblical parallels or the use of political football do you think either of those help understand why he's like so popular, like he's outsized in popularity?
Yes, absolutely. I think that Arthur appeals to so many people because he is whatever you need him to be, right? If you need him to be a mighty king who dispenses justice and peace throughout the land, he can be that. If you need a great warrior who slays giants, if you need someone to protect your church, right? Considering the Viking raids that would have been happening when Nennius was writing, the idea of a guy heroically defending churches from pagan invaders would have been incredibly popular. So yes, I absolutely think that is true, and that is part of Arthur's popularity. You can basically sort of graft whatever political values you want to onto him. There's an incredible example in the movie King Arthur from 2004. Where Arthur is played by Clive Owen. There's a part where he makes a speech and he's basically quoting the Declaration of Independence. And you men, you have been free since since your first breath. I'm like, that is not a thing people in 6th century Britain would have thought, like not even remotely. So Arthur, he's so politically malleable, you can literally make him an American hero. And it still works. So yes, great question. Anyone else? Yes?
So a key part of the Arthurian tale is a disconnect from his father. He's just a normal Joe until he gets a Excalibur,
Yes.
watery bent, throws a sword at him. Does that help to legitimize who you want to be the legitimate king, to not have to have him grow up in the castle with his king father?
Well, interestingly enough, in Monmouth, we have every reason to think that Arthur did grow up in the castle with his dad. We aren't really told anything about his childhood, but this is very interesting. Later writers always make it so that, as you said, Arthur is spirited away shortly after his birth, in no small part because he is perceived as a bastard. The predecessor to the sword and the stone motif is actually all the barons in England being like, this kid is a bastard. Why are we supposed to, have him as our ruler? And Merlin has to repeatedly tell them that Arthur is Uther and Igraine's son and has a claim to the throne. He has to do this 5 times. So this version of Arthur probably was raised with Uther. But later ones, absolutely, he is taken away, and in some cases specifically to be raised by better people. So that's not an element in Monmouth, but it is absolutely an element that enters into the story later. Great question. Yes?
So what's interesting to me is that, Monmouth is writing in the 12th century, but this is a legitimation myth about a Welsh king, even though we're 2 centuries removed from the ruling class being French people. So is this, I'm wondering, what purpose does the legitimation serve? Is it a cautionary tale about just we just gotta pick, somebody here, we have to pick the bastard son of the, this Norman, or is it a call to return to some other lineage that was beheaded by the Norman conquest?
I would say it's definitely the former. So it's important to remember, who are the foreign villains in this story? The Saxons. Who did the Normans defeat to take control of England? The Saxons. So what Rosemary Rogers, an Arthurian scholar, has said that the real star of this book, the main character, is Britain itself. In some ways, Monmouth is legitimizing, well, not just Arthur, but all of Britain, basically to wrap it up in a bow and give it to the Normans and say, this is your legacy now. You have inherited all of the good parts and you can reject all of the bad parts. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, what time we got?
Just a couple minutes.
Okay, got a couple minutes. Any more questions? Yes.
You're an amazing presenter. Is there anywhere to get more views?
Let me just asexually bud.
I mean, do you have a channel or a book? Or...
I do have a YouTube channel. It's fallen into disrepair because I got sick for quite a long time. But if you look for Rissy Reviews, that is my old YouTube channel. I'd love to get back into it. If you are interested in a book, I have thought about writing one based on all this. I just love this stuff. It's so fascinating, and well, hopefully I'll be giving seminars at GenCon next year.
Genuinely, I would watch anything you put on YouTube.
Oh my God, thank you so much. That is so sweet. Thank you.
Do you want Warhammer 40k lore and skincare?
Yeah, that's see, my channel is mostly me talking about the science behind skincare and skincare products and Warhammer novels.
At the same time. That sounds amazing.
Yeah. All right, so one more question. Anybody?
So Lancelot isn't added until later in the medieval period, right? When we have when we have to have that myth of the best hero.
Yes.
Right.
So Lancelot is introduced by a guy named Chrétien de Troyes, who is writing. He starts writing at the end of the 12th century. So he's a bit later than Monmouth, probably influenced by Monmouth. And his character is basically, so his name probably means the servant in French, because some of the texts that we have from Chrétien show his name spelled L''Oncelot, and in French, that would be the servant. So this theme is that he is the slave of Guinevere because of his love for her. He is a knight, a nobleman, reduced to being a servant, and he loves it.
That's a whole other talk.
Oh yeah, Lancelot would totally be paying for feed pics. All right. Well, if that's 50 after, all right, we should be getting out of here. But thank you guys so much. Fantastic audience. And I do have a few free minutes afterwards if we want to move out of here. We can geek out about Arthur together.